Welcome back to my channel. Today's presentation is about submitting in Data in Brief a journal of Elsevier. It's an example that will help you to learn how to submit a data article in a journal. Well, the presentation is a part of a playlist on open science, and previously we had a lot of videos related to open data. And I hope you watched the video about open data because it will be very helpful for today's presentation. Now, what is the objective of today's presentation is to understand the meaning and value of open data publishing, and for sure encourage you as a researcher to publish your data set in a journal. The content of today's presentation will go through the introduction, the ownership of data, the process of submission, making data available, how to prepare the submission and how to submit, and finally how to address the editor before some takeaway messages. So let's start with the introduction. Why is open data relevant and why should I publish my dataset in an article? Well, sharing datasets promises to speed discoveries and improve reproducibility and expand economic development in any region in the world. It promotes a more accurate verification of scientific results, and funders and publishers ask to share the data and consider themselves proprietary from collection to publication. So therefore, it worth to publish this data into journal articles. Now, what is the value of data? It is very important to publish in open data articles because the data should be able to be used by scientific community and researchers. Why are these data useful or important? Well, who can benefit from these data and how these stakeholders can benefit from it? Well, how can these data be used, reused, or further insight can be developed based on that? All that can be answered by publishing your data into a data article. Because through the publishing process of the data article, all these questions will be answered so that anybody later on can benefit from this data. Now, the Data in Brief journal is a gold open access journal, so it has an article processing fees. I invite you before publishing or thinking to publish to check these open access, to check these article processing fees to make sure if you can cover it or not. Let's go to the second important element of today's presentation, ownership. Before I think about publishing my data set in an article, I must clarify who owns the data. So, I need to distinguish the data ownership because original data have to be produced by the authors at a recognized professional research or academic institution. You need to distinguish dataset owner and other functions, specific roles that require distinguishing. Who is the owner? Who is the curator? Who is the steward? Is there any governance board that regulate that? And it's very important here to look at these aspects so that when you decide to publish, you might need to have a permission of the owner of the data, or even sometimes the owner will force you to publish. So it's important to make sure that the owners of the data are clearly notified and there is a consent, and to avoid any confusion. And let me give you an example. For example, this is a project funded by the European Union. It's an Interreg project, Atlantic area. It's called CIRMA. This project is a consortium of different universities involving Minio, College of Dublin, Vigo, University of Vigo, University of Nantes, University of Surrey, AZVI and the Irish Rail, the infrastructure of Portugal, Queen's University Belfast, the University of Birmingham. Big consortium. Those scientists working in this project, they generated data sets. Here comes the questions. Who is the owner? And if they want to publish this data set in a data article, who will be the owner and how they will sign authorship or ownership agreement? So here, author seems to be describing the data from a European project in collaboration with several universities. According to them, they are the sole owners of the data presented in the manuscript. Apparently, this is a data set created by Work Package 4. So here comes the question, what should the editor do? Editors might feel suspicious and they will suspect if there's any ethical problem, and they will ask if the authorship confirmation is clear and the ownership confirmation is clear. And therefore, when you submit your data article in the journal, for example, in Data in Brief, I advise you to have a form which is called the ownership confirmation form. You just can write a statement by saying what is the type of ownership of this data. For example, you can say all authors assert ownership over research data discussed in the manuscript. This can be a form and they have to sign. Another option can be all authors are stewards and custodians of the research data, and then they sign. You can have another form, all authors have participated in the conception and design or analysis and interpretation of the data, B, drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, C, approval of the final version, and this manuscript has not been submitted to nor in any under review in any organization. So these are the statements that can be written, and then you can clarify. And sometimes you can even ask the owners or the funders to put this statement for you and give you a kind of allow you to publish the data in their name. So this is one of the most important parts in when you publish a journal article, a data article in a journal. Now, if this is clarified, what is the process to publish my data article? Well, first of all, you have to look at the following aspects. There is two types of publication of data articles. Either you have a related research data article. This is called companion article, which means what? You have already written a full article and you submitted it in a classical journal article. So you just have a full article submitted in another journal, classical, where you use this data, okay? You have deposited the research data after in a relevant depository, and then when your full article, where you are talking about the result of the analysis of your work, got accepted, you can write and submit your data article to the Journal of Data in Brief as a paper, and here you will cite this data set and link your full article to your new data article. This is an option. So again, I have a data set. This data set, I used it and I published a thematic article in another journal. Let's say I published an article in the Journal of Building and Energy, okay, or Energy and Buildings. And after getting published, I want to publish the data set in the Journal of Data in Brief. So I wait until my journal in Energy and Building got published, then I put my data set in a depository, and then I submit a data article in the Journal of Data in Brief. This is option one. Option two, that I directly have a data article, meaning that I will directly publish the data set itself regardless of if I have a thematic article related to it or not. So here I prepare my data set, I make it available on a depository, I write and submit my data article in the Journal of Data in Brief, and then I cite the data set. And that's it. This is option A, this is option B. It is more recommended to use option A because in this case you will have a data that processed the result and benefit from it, and then you have an article that puts the data as a data article. But if you only want to have the data article like a data raw data as it is in an article with some description, you can select option B. It is up to you. So let me show you what happens when you submit your paper. Well, when you are submitting your paper, you will have always a question that tells you, please answer the required question regarding if there is a supporting research article or not. Yes, my submission is directly related to a full research article, and I will upload a copy of my previously published article. Or you say, no, my submission is not related to a research article or any other journal. So those are the two options, option A and option B. In option A, I already published a paper, and now I'm publishing the data in an article that was used in this earlier paper. Option B, I'm directly publishing the data set as a data article. So I'm saying my submission is not related to any previous published work. Now, once you clarified if you are going for option A or B, both are possible, now you can make sure to check how to make your data available. Now, in general, you need to make your data available in a primary format. So your primary data needs to be available like tables, graphs, figures. You have to pack everything in a zip file if possible. Don't leave it like huge formats to make sure that it is compact. Deposit your data in a public repository, and we earlier had a presentation about how to share your data in public repositories. There was a video about publishing data. So you can look at Dataverse, Harvard Dataverse, you can publish it in Mendeley data, you can publish it in Zenodo, whatever public depository, if you have a national public depository. And once it is published there, data might be hosted then with the article, and you can make sure that the link works and it has a DOI. Because once you publish your data set on the depository, you now can share it as part of your research article, the full research article, or as part of your data article. Now, I'm done with my sharing of my data set on a public repository. Now I'm going to prepare my submission to the Journal of Data in Brief. Well, data in brief, first thing to do, I have to consult the guide of authors. I have to use the data in brief template. I have to download it. And I start to my filling this data in brief template. And as you can see, the template has some format. It will ask you for the article, data article title, authors, affiliations, keywords, abstract specifications. And I need to fill up this information. First of all, what is the subject I'm talking about in this data set that I'm going to publish? Because now, don't forget the following. I have a data set, and I'm now publishing a data article that describes this data set. So a data article simply is a more developed form of your data set that includes information about this data set. So I talk about the subject, what is the subject area, what are the type of data I'm sharing with the public. Is it tables, is it images, charts, graphs, figures? I need to describe that here in the template. How was this data acquired? Here I have to talk about the data collection process, when, how, what are the parameters that I used, everything I did around it. What is the format of my data? Is it raw data? Is it analyzed data? Is it filtered data? Is it screened data? All that I have to say it. So I have to list the formats, and I have to list the treatment that I did. And finally, I have to describe the data collection process, and I say I have to provide a brief description of the conditions that were used for data collection. So these are some of the items that needs to be answered. To follow up, I need to describe the data source location. So here I can cite the data source location, which is the repository, Mendeley, Harvard Dataverse, Zenodo, whatever depository I'm using. Here I can cite it, and I must mention the DOI. And finally, I have to talk here about data accessibility, and I have to show that this data is made available. Is it in a public format? I have to say if it is primary data or secondary data. I have to talk about the fair sharing principles that I discussed in earlier videos. And by that, I am giving more transparency about the data accessibility. And finally, I have to talk about the related research articles. And here, if I published previously a journal article where I used this data and processed it, I can cite it here. If not, I will not cite anything. And for sure, the last part is the value of the data. Very important. I need to talk about it. What is the value of this data? What is the added value? What does it bring? Who might be the potential beneficiary people? So I describe the data after. I put all information about the experimental design and materials and methods. If there is any ethical statements, if there is personal data collected, I need to talk about the GDPR, I need to talk about the protection, about the consent, and so on. And at the end, I have to credit all the authors who are involved in this process. So this is all what I have to do just to submit my data article, and just filling this information and sharing my depository makes me qualified to have my data article ready for submission. Now, when you start the submission process, here we are ready to do it. What should we do? I have to write a cover letter. In the cover letter, I can address the editor, preferably search for the name, explain what is this data article about, why is it important, what is its value, who participated in it, in a brief way, and I can mention who can be benefiting from this data article and what are the parameters involved in this data article, and finally I ask the editors to review my request of publication. Data in brief template has to be fully respected, and as I showed you earlier, all these aspects has to be included: title, author, affiliation, abstract, completed specification table, explanation why the data is valuable, the users, a complete description of the experimental method, and so on. So I go through it and I start the submission process on the data in brief platform. Excuse me if this is not very clear, but when you are submitting, you submit a cover letter, you submit the template, and you will find a submission called Research Data Depository. You click on it and they will even ask you in the journal what is the depository that you are using. I can see here a list of depositories: Dryad, Dataverse, HepData, Earth Chemical, Mendeley, ModelDB, Norsa, Ornell, Pangea, and so on. I just select the data repository and I put my DOI number, and this automatically will be part of the submission. As you can see, I have here 3 files: cover letter, graphical abstract, manuscript, and my research data. It will be 4 elements. By that, I can proceed to the next step and make sure that I have a DOI number, you can see it here, for the repository. Now, preparing for submission should involve that I have ethical committee approval for my data that I collected. So if you are collecting personal data or you are doing surveys, then you must have a letter of your ethical committee if this is a best practice or mandated in your institution or your country. Data gathered using social media, I need to have a consent. Then I have to suggest some reviewers to help the editors, because sometimes the editors, they are not in your field, so you give them 3 names at least for reviewers. You have to associate your work with a graphical abstract to make it more visible in the online version. You must maybe have a list of abbreviation, acknowledgements, and for sure you must have indication of who are the funding sources of your work. By that, you can submit and your work is ready to be reviewed. If you want to know what the editor will do, bear with me with this last section of our presentation. Well, the editor will first of all check the originality of your work, and the editors, they have access to anti-plagiarism software that will detect how this work matches existing literature and if there is any plagiarism. They will ask if this data is primary or secondary, treated or raw, and based on that they will go check every other aspect of your work. Now this is a list that editors use in the Journal of Data in Brief to check and evaluate the work. They will see what is the data originality, is it really original? Are the author providing a statement of ownership? Are they confirming that this is their own work? Are the data secondary or primary? Is the data based on questionnaires and surveys? If it's based on questionnaire and surveys, is it direct? Is the questionnaire included or not? You are publishing a data article, so you will not be collecting data using a survey and then hiding your survey. So the survey need to be included. Is the questionnaire survey providing all the answers? Is it anonymized or not? Do the author adequately explain the research community and the utility of these data and its value within this research community? This is all the checks that editors will do. They will continue checking if the data is well described clearly, is the protocol of data collection and the experimental design, materials and methods section well written, have the authors provided the raw data in the form of tables or graphs or images or charts. Did they describe that? Are the data publicly available? Did they share the link on the repository? The editor most of the time will click on the repository link and check and even download the data and download the zip file, unzip the file and check if this data is in a proper format or not. And finally, they will check if the data article is related to an existing primary research article before published or not, and they will inquire through the process to make sure that finally they can answer those questions by yes or no, and finally they can write their famous report, and then the paper, if everything is okay, will be most probably published, but with a request of minor or major modifications. So this is the end of today's presentation. Some takeaway messages when you want to publish in Data in Brief. Well, how can I submit a data article in the Journal of Data in Brief in Elsevier? Data should be owned by the authors. Make sure of that. The raw data must be made freely available. Check this through a depository or make it through a repository. You have to ask yourself, is the data deposit in a repository and is the link active and available? Make sure that the data is readable in a readable format and not simulation data. Make sure you have real experimental measured data. Don't go run simulations or don't go create future weather data based on interpolations and then tell people that this is data. This is synthetic data. Make sure that you have as much as possible raw data unless you have a justification, a very strong justification to use this synthetic data. Negative data, even if you have a negative result, can be published. Questionnaires and survey must be published. Don't hesitate, put the survey. And for sure, you have to write your full article and submit it, and then submit the data paper. That's my personal advice. If somebody works with me, I tell them first, publish your journal paper, the full article that is treating or using this data, publish the result, and then publish a data article. But doing it the other way around, for me personally, doesn't make sense. So it's very important to look at that. And finally, share your data article with colleagues and make sure they can have access to it. By that, I end up today's presentation, which is part of a playlist on open science. I hope I gave you a good example of how to publish a data article in a journal. For sure, it has article processing fees. Maybe you can find other journals that do it for free, or maybe you can find funding for your article processing fee when you are writing the proposal. But what is here very important is that we are not only publishing articles and journals or data set in a raw format through depositories. We can also publish data articles to make the data described well, accessible to others, and promote this data. By that, I end up today's presentation. Don't hesitate to comment, don't hesitate to share. If you have any complementary information, don't hesitate to check the website of the Data in Brief for updates, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much.